If we could only do one thing that would grow the business more than anything else, what would that be? Is a question that I think every real estate agent, team leader should be asking themselves today. So this was something that came up yesterday and I want to share, but where this came from was the fact that your job as the CEO, my job as the CEO of my company, is to make sure that our resources are being used in the absolute best way possible to grow the business, with obviously that being the goal. In the first 50 days of the year so far this year, we have sold over $1 million in sales volume every single day. And even with that, we're on pace to be on doing our goal this year, which is a huge growth year this year. And meanwhile, this week on Monday, I pulled my leadership team and I said, hey, we need to do an emergency meeting. So today I'm going to share with you how I decided we needed to make this call and what we talked about and what we ended up doing. So in this podcast is specifically for team leaders and broker owners that are looking to grow their business. I am sharing my experience, good and bad. Now, I figured I would talk about this in the moment rather than talking about it in hindsight. And that's one of the things that I'm probably most excited about making this particular podcast only being for team leaders, is this is the best possible way to watch the story of us growing Onyx Homes from start to finish. And if you want the absolute closest look inside, is joining our free community. So if you want to go to onyxhomes.com/school, that will get you to the community. It's totally free. Check it out. We share a lot of stuff in there. But anyway, let's get into the content. So we paid a truckload of money to go to acquisition.com's workshops, and we learned how they grow businesses. If you're not familiar, Alex Ramosi, acquisition.com, they're a private equity company that makes a lot of money, and they know how to run businesses certainly much better than we do. And they operate on the theory of constraints. So there's three major things that we'll talk about today that really impacted my decision making here. So the number one is the theory of constraints. Number two is your job as the CEO is to allocate resources. And number three is the word focus, which was the theme of last year and really over the last 18 months. And then this year, our major theme is just grow, all towards growth for this year. So let's talk about these three things. So the first one is the theory of constraints. And the theory here is your business will grow up until the point where it's constrained, and then it will no longer continue to grow. So the best way to explain this is think of a manufacturing facility. Let's say we're making cars, and if the car manufacturer can make 5 steering wheels, 1 engine, 5 sets of tires every single day, how many cars can they make per day? Well, they can only make 1 car because they can only make 1 engine. So the engine is the constraint of that business. Now, if they could move to 3 engines a day, they would 3x the business. And any efforts on growing, making more tires or making more steering wheels would be completely wasted because you cannot make any more cars because of the constraint was at the engine. Now, once you get the engine constraint removed and maybe they make 20 engines a day, well, then the next constraint will reveal itself. So allocating your resources, this moves into section number 2. So that's the theory of constraints. So figuring out what your constraint is probably one of the most important things you should do in your business right now. Number 2 is your job as a CEO is to allocate your limited resources against unlimited opportunities. So knowing that the constraint for our business right now is marketing, in the sense that we generate tons of leads for our agents. However, a lot of our deal flow comes from referral partners like Zillow, like Realtor.com, OpCity, so on and so on, where we're not really in control of the lead flow there. They're a great partner. We love those relationships. But if they said, hey, Christian, we're going to 10x leads or we're going to cut them in half, our business is affected by that. And we aren't in control of that. So our constraint is deal flow that we control. And if we could 5x the amount of deal flow that we're doing, we know we could recruit the agents. We know we could train and onboard something else would break. But we know that if we could generate twice as many, 3 times as many, 4 times as many deals, that the business would grow, obviously. So that's our constraint. Now, the third part is focus. So knowing that our constraint is marketing and deal flow, and I'm filming this on February 25th, 2025. We just 60 days ago did our annual planning, and we follow EOS, and we have our vision, we have our 3-year, we have all those things. And one thing that I've realized, 2 things that I've realized in the last 6 months to a year, probably 9 months, is if we don't identify and have the constraint in front of us at all times, it gets lost. And the reason it's a constraint is because we're stuck. And fixing the problem that we're stuck on, you're only stuck on it because you don't know how to solve the problem. And then constantly focusing on solving a problem that you don't know how to solve is really hard in business. It's much easier to go do something else, to focus on something you are good at, that you enjoy more, that you enjoy doing more, whatever it might be. But the reality is, if we set 5 goals, and one of those 5 goals is to fix the constraint, and the other 4 are things that would grow the business, but not nearly as much as if we've solved the constraint, we should not focus on those other 4 things. And in the first 55 days of this year, we have very much done a very good job of hitting the other 4 goals, but not the most important one. And the reality is that if we hit the most important one, the other 4 don't really matter. The business will grow, period. And not that the other 4 aren't important, they're just not nearly as important as the most important goal. So I've got some tactical things that I will share that we are changing. So number 1, tactical, is we are putting the constraint in front of our face at all times. I put it above our goals. This is our constraint on our leadership board. Number 2 is we are prioritizing our goals. And to be honest, we set 5 goals this year. Number 1 was very clear. Number 2 was like, yeah, this is the second most important. 3, 4, 5 were like, these would help the business, but not even remotely in the same ballpark as 1 and 2. We're solving number 1, and we're not moving on to number 2 until number 1 is done. And the reality here is we set 5 goals thinking we're going to accomplish all of them, and we're going to work on each one of them concurrently. We're going to work on all 5 things at the same time, and then they're all going to get done at the end. And there's 2 major problems with that. Is number 1, the hardest problem is the hardest problem. And most people just naturally will avoid the hardest problem. So that means the other things will probably get done before we even really start working on the first one. As opposed to taking and again, the job of the CEO is to allocate resources, as opposed to the CEO saying, hey, hold on a second. And this is what I did on Monday. So let me put you in my mindset over the weekend and then making the decision on Monday. Is we have several big initiatives that we are going to do this year, or maybe not, who knows. But I realized that we were putting probably 80% of our effort into the 4 major goals and only 20% into the most important one. So I called a leadership meeting and we sat down and I said, hey, we want to refocus. And how much effort were we putting in the most important thing? And it was probably 20%, honestly, if that. It was if that. So what we changed was we said, okay, we were putting most of our efforts over in this, I'll just be broad, right? Over in this bucket over here. And let's move almost all of those resources to solve the major problem. And what that ended up doing was we were able to say that by the end of this meeting, if we moved all of these resources over to the way more important goal, how much more likely is it that we actually hit that goal? And by the end of it, it was an absolute no-brainer. And the question for me is like, how did we get that far off base just 50 days ago when we set goals in the first place? And the reality is we just looked at the hard problem that we don't know how to solve, because this has been a problem. This is a problem for almost every team, for the record. But like, we didn't know how to solve this problem. We don't know how to solve this problem. We think we do. We have theories. We have we're going in the right direction and a lot of different things, but we haven't fixed it yet. So it's easy to shy away from, versus doing new things is always fun and shiny, or tinkering on things that, will marginally improve onboarding or whatever, is easier than solving this main problem. And I think that's really why at the end of the day that this came up. But that was the major point of our conversation on Monday was, 1, do we need to reallocate resources? The answer is yes. Number 2 is, what resources are we going to allocate? Number 3 is, do we need to add anything to make sure, if nothing else gets done this year, other than putting us at 100% in control of our deal flow, that will materially change the business. It changes the financials of the business. It changes how fast we can grow the company. That if we can find a machine where we put $1 in and we get $5 out, and we can crank and grow the business by 2x in a year, we're going to do that. So that's where all of the focus has gone. So there's a few different things here. This is the tactical, is we put the constraint in front of our face so that it's there. Number 2 is we list our goals in priority. Number 3 is we are not moving on to number 2 until number 1 is done. So I would imagine that I could have gone back in time in my running the company before. I have run into this problem 100 times where I feel something's off and we didn't do anything. So in the past, I just kind of naturally said, well, we set our goals, we set our rocks. We'll look at that next quarter, because we follow EOS, where you're not supposed to change rocks, you're not supposed to do whatever. But the reality is that's just not how business works. And when you know something's wrong, you need to act on it. So finding the constraint is the most important thing. And I can give you a few different lessons that I've talked about probably in previous episodes. But last year, about this time, our constraint was we did not have enough agents to handle the lead flow that we had. It was a very different constraint than we have right now. We didn't have enough agents to handle the leads and the deal flow that we had. So we turned our recruiting machine on, which we know how to recruit very well. As previous episodes talking about exactly how we do that. Once we did that, we were bringing on agents, and the constraint then moved from how do we find agents to onboard to how do we make sure we onboard and train them. We were training them well, but like, how do we make sure they're onboarding as effectively as possible? And we hired an office administrator that allowed us to basically double, triple, quadruple. We have not reached that constraint again. So we hired one person, and it allowed us to basically double the amount of agents, at least, that we can recruit and bring on. So our constraint moved from we didn't have enough agents and leads to now we were getting enough agents, but the constraint was like getting them onboarded and getting them trained up and running fast. And now we have enough agents to handle our current deal flow, but we want to increase our deal flow so that we can generate a ton of leads for all of our agents and do more deals and have the deals be the margins that we want, because we're in control of the deal. We're doing the advertising. So that is like over the last 18 months, those are the constraints that we ended up solving. And I was listening to a podcast today where it is just very, very normal for business owners to look away from their really hard problems to solve. I've done this before in the past. I am currently doing it right now, other than filming this content, of course. But right when I hop off this is my last piece of content that I'm making for the day, is I'm going to spend the rest of my day and all night and all morning tomorrow before I get in on the most important, solving the most important problem. And I'm just making this episode is very short. This is because I wanted to share this happening in the moment. And I want to explain how I got to the conclusion that we needed to reallocate these resources. And transparently speaking, we're reallocating the resources from focusing on my personal brand to focusing more on content marketing to drive leads and deals through our deal. That is consumer facing. And this is something that when we made the decision to do this yesterday, I guess, it just felt we knew this was the right decision to do. And I think we talked about this in our leadership meeting, and we just didn't do it because it was the hard thing to do, and there's a lot of resources, and we needed to hire more people, we need to spend more money, we need to do all these different things, and we shied away from it because it was hard. And I know I've said that 100 times so far in this episode, but making the hard decisions is what makes the money. And I say this to our salespeople all the time, is your ability to have hard conversations as a salesperson is directly correlated to your income, and it's no different from an owner. So anyway, that is today's episode, focusing on the theory of constraints, reallocating resources, and focus. So if you want the closest possible look at us growing the company, go to onyxhomes.com/school. It'll be in the description and everywhere there. If you enjoyed this episode, like and subscribe, share it with a friend who needs to refocus on what they're doing. And I make this content because I wish I would have honestly had this so I didn't have to learn the lessons myself. So hopefully you can learn these lessons from me. And like I said, if you like the video, share it with somebody else, or the podcast if you're listening to it. That is another episode down in the story of me building Onyx Homes from start to finish, and I'll see you in the next one.